Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this fall fundraiser for the Heartland Health Research Alliance. It's wonderful to have you here. We wish we could be in person, but still it's good to have you here virtually by Zoom. I'm Dr. Philip Landrigan. I'm a pediatrician and epidemiologist. I direct the program for global public health and the common good at Boston College. I'm the chair of the Science Advisory Board for the Heartland Health Research Alliance. So let me tell you briefly about the Alliance and why I'm in it, and then others will tell you a lot more. I came to this because I'm a pediatrician. I've worked for more than 40 years to understand how chemical hazards in the environment affect children's health. I've worked over the years on lead, pesticides, industrial chemicals, air pollution, and always have done studies with an eye to understanding how these toxic chemicals affect the health of infants and children, and then using the findings from those studies to craft strategies to protect children against them. I was involved in removing lead from gasoline back in the 1970s, an action that reduced blood lead levels in American children by 95% and led to a 5-point increase in the IQ of every American child born since 1980. I was one of a team of people who did this. Starting in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, I worked with Dr. Chuck Benbrook of the Heartland Health Alliance. We were then together at the National Academy of Sciences. We produced a report that fundamentally revised how the federal government of the United States regulates children's exposure to pesticides. It led to passage of major legislation, the Food Quality Protection Act. And now I'm involved in the Heartland Health Research Alliance at this stage of my life because the goal of this magnificent group of scientists and physicians and nurses and activists and community workers is to understand precisely how the chemical pesticides, how the chemical herbicides that are applied in such massive quantities to food crops in the middle of the United States, in the heartland of our great country. We're trying to understand how these chemicals affect children's health. Do they affect children's reproduction? Do they have reproductive capacity for the future? Do they affect children's immune systems? Do they cause risk of other diseases? That's why we're here this evening, is to hear about this and to ask for your support for this magnificent ongoing work. And finally, I have a very personal interest in this work. At Boston College, I direct a program that is training the next generation of workers in public health. These will be pediatricians and nurses, epidemiologists and public health scientists. And through the generosity of the Heartland Health Research Alliance, we were able to support a summer fellowship program this past summer, which educated 14 young women and men to understand how pesticides affect children's health and what they can do about it as they mature into their careers. You'll be hearing from a couple of these young folks tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Chuck Benbrook, who's the co-host of this fundraiser and the executive director of the Heartland Health Research Alliance. Chuck, over to you.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate the introduction, and let me share with everyone how we got to this point. In 2016, I published a paper on the trend since the mid-1970s in the use of glyphosate, both in the US and globally. And in this paper, I documented the really phenomenal growth in the use of glyphosate, or glyphosate-based herbicides for short, that began in 1996 with the approval and planting of the first genetically modified organisms in corn, soybeans, and cotton that were resistant to glyphosate. By 2014, this paper reported in the peer-reviewed literature that by 2014, enough glyphosate was applied on US cropland to spray 3/4 of a pound of the active ingredient on every cropland acre in the country. Globally, 2/3 of a pound of glyphosate could be applied to every cropland acre on the planet if it was spread out evenly. This paper that I published was the source of the now frequently cited fact that glyphosate is the most widely used pesticide ever discovered and marketed, and both in the US and globally, and by a wide margin. There's never been another pesticide used anywhere near as heavily or widely as glyphosate. Also in 2016, it had become clear that there were a number of different reasons to be concerned about glyphosate use going up more in the future, because glyphosate-resistant weeds had migrated from the southeastern United States, north and west, and were beginning to show up in the Midwest. And we knew that when superweeds made it to the Midwest, there was going to be a significant increase in herbicide, because this is what has to happen when farmers are dealing with what we call superweeds. They force farmers to spray additional herbicides more frequently and often at higher rates. And obviously, this draws farmers onto kind of a herbicide treadmill from which there is really no easy exit. Also in 2016, with a team of international scientists, we published a consensus statement about public health concerns about rising use of glyphosate and exposures. We focused on glyphosate's connection with certain cancers, with birth. Those events documenting the huge increase in the use of glyphosate, the spread of superweeds into the Midwest, and growing concern from the scientific literature about the risks that could be triggered by exposures to glyphosate is really what led a team of people to come together and think about what could be done to address this problem. The team of scientists that came together, including the good Dr. Landrigan, we wanted to avoid the typical 20 years it takes EPA to collect all the science and do all the analysis and deal with all the data submitted by companies and all the legal challenges that makes the pesticide regulatory process so torturously long and takes so many years. We really didn't want to see it take 10, 20, 30 years to understand the impact of rising herbicide use in the Midwest on birth outcomes and children's development. So we decided to design a scientific study that would be capable, if there are adverse impacts, this study would detect them. And that is how the Heartland Study came into being. We don't have all the answers. Nobody does yet, but there's many reasons to be concerned about the really unprecedented increase in herbicide use and exposures in the Midwestern United States. This is a region of the country where almost a third of Americans live and work. So, you know, of course, we would have hoped that the government, about 10 years ago when herbicide use started to go up first, that the government would have invested money through the National Institutes of Health, through the Centers for Disease Control to study this problem, but they didn't, and they likely won't, and they won't because this is a very touchy subject that many stakeholders really would prefer is just left alone. So this is why we need your help, and we ask for your help today to make it possible for the Heartland Health Research Alliance to carry out science that clearly is needed, but isn't going to happen unless a private organization like HHRA and private individuals and foundations are willing to put up the funding that's required to conduct this sophisticated and expensive science. So that's what we're here for today, and we look forward to sharing some of what we've been doing in HHRA, and I'm going to turn it over now to the HHRA Operations Manager, Rachel Benbrook.
I'm Rachel Benbrook. I'm the operations manager for the Heartland Health Research Alliance. I came to the organization with over a decade of experience working with environmental nonprofits on habitat restoration, water quality, and community engagement projects here in my home in Puget Sound. When my father asked me to come and help him start the Heartland Study and eventually found the Heartland Health Research Alliance, I was new to the world of food and farming, but I quickly realized that when it comes to the health of people and the planet, there are few avenues where you can create the most substantive change than in the world of agriculture. The way we grow our food touches so many other realms like climate change, soil quality, biodiversity, and of course the health of communities. I'm really excited to be working with HHRA, and I'm here to tell you a little bit more about the organization and the work that we do. Thank you so much for being here, and we thank you for your support.
All right, hello everybody. I'm Rachel, and I'm going to take over for a little bit to talk to you about HHRA. Before I do that, a few technical notes. First of all, you might have noticed that this webinar is being recorded. That's just so we can share it with people who weren't able to be there today. Also, all attendees joined muted, but rest assured you will be able to ask questions later. On that note, please hold those questions until the Q&A at the end. And for best results, set your Zoom window to full screen. We kind of have a little window here that shows you how to do that. If you need help with that or any other technical assistant, please email info@hh-ra.org or send a chat via Zoom to HHRA staff member Grace Cook, who will be standing by to help out. And if you're ready to give at any time, you can text donate, and that's not case sensitive, so uppercase, lowercase, whatever works for you. Text donate to 844-977-4472. Or you can visit our website at hh-ra.org/donate. The Heartland Health Research Alliance was founded in 2020 to conduct and communicate cutting-edge science to enhance public and environmental health. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and all donations are tax deductible. I am here today to tell you a little bit more about the work we do and to share some stories from the amazing people who make up our alliance.
Hello everybody, my name is Grace Cook. I'm the Project Support Coordinator for the Heartland Health Research Alliance. I'm a recent college grad from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. I have a Bachelor of Science in Biology and Environmental Studies. I grew up here on this small horse farm in very, very rural Wisconsin. Our property is surrounded by either cornfields or soybean fields depending on the time of year. And that's pretty common for a lot of people in the rural Midwest. So when I was little, I do remember the pesticide tractors. They roll right down the road past my house to spray the fields right behind me here. And I mean, it took me until right now, age 22, to finally understand how those years of exposure to pesticides could impact my parents' health, my little sister's health, my health, and even the health of my children in the future. We are surrounded here by soybean fields. Sometimes they're cornfields. These are my horse barns. And then you can kind of see here, that's my house, the red building, how close we are to all of these farm fields. They extend all the way over there up to the highway and back around here. My dad is like so many other homeowners here in the Heartland that just assume that a product you can buy off the shelf, and not to mention a product that we spray on our food, would be safe for him to use. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And I am concerned for my dad's health, as we now know that pesticide exposures have been linked to multiple health issues like cancer, endocrine disruption, gut microbiome disruption, and fertility issues. So I'm at a stage in my life where I could start having children. So my fertility and my daily exposures is really something that weighs heavily on me and a lot of my friends. Everybody deserves to know what we're exposed to on a daily basis. And health is absolutely a human right. And that's why I really love working for HHRA, because they are doing such important research for the families in the Heartland so they can better understand how the farm down the road and our food on our table will impact the health of their families for generations.
And now to expand on something Grace touched on in her video, the impact of pesticides on reproduction. It turns out that the dose of a toxin matters, but so does the developmental stage of the person exposed. Pregnant women and the babies they carry are particularly vulnerable. Also growing children, their small body size and relatively limited diets make them more prone to health impacts from pesticide exposure. Dr. Landrigan said it well in a recent interview. A dose that will bounce off you and me will not bounce off an infant. Instead, it could cause brain damage and result in permanent injury. Like all of you, we are concerned about the health of future generations, thus our focus on the health of pregnant women, infants, and children. Now a bit more on HHRA and the work we do. Our research is conceived, conducted, and managed by scientists, physicians, and the clinicians, the people on the front lines. Our mission is to promote cutting-edge science, systems, and policies impacting how food is grown and processed to enhance public health, environmental quality, and the well-being of workers and rural communities. We are proud of our multidisciplinary team of board members, including practicing doctors, scientific researchers, and experts on food and farming practices. And now a little bit about the landscape that we work in and what problems HHRA was founded to address. Farmers are relying on pesticides now more than ever. Our research is carefully designed to determine the public health impacts of this rising pesticide use. As pesticide use increases, so does exposure. When a farmer sprays their fields, some of that pesticide ends up in the air we breathe, in drinking water, and in dust particles that get brought into the house on clothing and shoes. This environmental exposure is especially concerning in heartland communities surrounded by farm fields. But all of us, no matter where we live, are exposed to pesticide residues via the food we eat. HHRA was founded to study the public health impacts of this environmental and dietary pesticide exposure. For example, let's consider glyphosate, the most used herbicide in the world. This chart shows that as glyphosate use, shown on the green bars here, has increased, so too has levels in people, the red line. This study sampled older adults living in Rancho Bernardo, California. We want to find out what herbicide levels look like in people living at the epicenter of American agriculture, the heartland. Side note, you may recognize glyphosate as the active ingredient in Monsanto's infamous herbicide Roundup. Used by millions of homeowners as well as farmers, this popular herbicide can still be purchased today at garden and hardware stores all around the country. Herbicides like glyphosate are pesticides used to control weeds. The introduction of genetically engineered glyphosate-tolerant crops in 1996 transformed weed management in America and around the world. Since their corn and soybean crops were now tolerant to the herbicide, farmers could spray the chemical right on top of their green fields throughout the growing season. Glyphosate use became ubiquitous wherever corn and soybeans were grown, but weeds quickly adapted and became resistant to the herbicide, like this cornfield overrun with resistant weeds. This forced farmers to spray more often in greater quantities and to add other herbicides to the mix. This is an example of what we call a pesticide treadmill. The more you spray, the more selective pressure you create on pests, leading to resistance, which in turn leads to more pesticide use. Farmers are now stuck on this herbicide treadmill. Corn and soybeans are the two most widely planted herbicide-tolerant crops. The American Midwest accounts for around 70% of the corn and 86% of the soybean crops in the US. In 2018, almost 350 million pounds of herbicides were sprayed on corn and soybeans across the 13-state Heartland region. What are the human and environmental health consequences of all this pesticide use? Pesticide exposure has been linked to a slew of health problems. A few examples are shown here. HHRA was founded to conduct and disseminate targeted, independent, and interdisciplinary research to zero in on the possible health impacts of rising exposures. With your help, we hope we can finally answer these tough questions. We want to highlight one important health issue we are tackling, the impact of pesticide exposure on the microbiome. The human microbiome is made up of millions of bacteria, viruses, and fungi that live within our intestinal tract and elsewhere in and on our bodies. These internal residents help us in many ways, some of which we are just discovering. HHRA scientists are concerned about the widespread use of pesticides and animal drugs that kill bacteria, including the most heavily used pesticide in history, glyphosate. With your help, we're going to expand this microbiome work.
I'm Robert Menage, and I'm working as a toxicologist at King's College London, and I've been working with HHRA as a consultant for a few years. I joined HHRA because I found the study fascinating. It's addressing my concerns about pesticides by making studies in human populations. The gut microbiome has been underexplored in science. It's been only a few decades that we realize that it is a very important organ in our body and it's very important for our health. It's influencing disease locally on the intestine, and we know that since a while, but it's also influencing disease in distant organ, and the gut microbiome can influence the brain. So the gut microbiome can influence cognition and also neurodegenerative disease. So if a chemical like glyphosate or pesticides affect the gut microbiome by killing good bacteria, it will affect the protective role of the gut microbiome. And so this is likely to cause some disease which have never been detected in regulatory tests. HHRA is very different from other studies because of its depth, its size, and the scope of the study. HHRA is looking at effects of pesticides in human population, in real life situations, and also in laboratory animals to understand the mechanisms. And it's only by having this integrative view of pesticide effects that the science will move forward and protect public health. Donating to HHRA can be helping the science move forward in universities.
Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing a little bit about HHRA and the Heartland Study. So we are definitely going to be on top of the rising use of herbicides, and we will be documenting and publishing papers about rising levels of exposure from testing urine samples from the pregnant women enrolled in the Heartland Study. So that's sort of standard issues science to understand the impact of a chemical on birth outcomes. We're going to be looking at some outcomes that are a common feature of these kinds of studies, but also we're going to include, we have included in the Heartland Study protocol, some new impacts that science is only beginning to document. Robin spoke about the impacts of glyphosate on the microbiome, the bacteria in the human gut. It turns out that glyphosate was initially patented as an antibiotic. It kills bacteria. So it's not surprising that glyphosate exposures through the food, most of us are getting exposed to glyphosate every day in our diet, unless we're eating all organic food. It can be having an impact on the microbiome. We are one of the first studies in the human population where we're going to try to track what some of those impacts are and whether they're having a negative impact on the health of women during pregnancy or on children. We're also doing cutting edge work that's never been done anywhere in the world on the impact of prenatal herbicide exposures on what's called epigenetic changes in the newborns. This is a complicated way in which low dose exposures to chemicals can alter how a person responds to diseases, bacteria, viruses throughout life and into adulthood. So we're also going to be using so-called omic technologies. We're going to be sequencing DNA to try to look for the first subtle markers of the progression to disease in people, so that perhaps there will be ways to intervene and prevent a disease from manifesting. This is very exciting, cutting edge work, which we'd like to be able to incorporate into this large birth cohort study called the Heartland Study, but we're only going to be able to do it if we can raise really a boatload of money, because sequencing DNA is still expensive. So I wanted just to stress what some of the really exciting and cutting edge science is that we'd like to be able to carry out through the Heartland Study and in the work of HHRA, if you will help us do that. Thank you. Now let's go back into the program and hear from some of our other senior scientists.
We are particularly concerned about the impact of pesticide exposure on our most vulnerable, pregnant women, infants, and children. When Dr. Paul Winchester started working at the neonatal intensive care unit at Franciscan Health Hospital in Indianapolis, Indiana, he noticed that there were more sick babies than he expected in those hallways. He started to wonder what might be different about the Midwest that could be driving this, and began to explore the role of pesticide exposure on pregnancy. The quote here is from an early study he led with a group of pregnant women at his hospital. Now he is one of the lead researchers of our flagship project, the Heartland Study. The Heartland Study is a medical research project which was conceived by our alliance of doctors and researchers to try and find out why there were so many sick babies in Dr. Winchester's hospital and in NICUs all around the Heartland. The core question we want to answer is whether rising herbicide exposure is leading to reproductive problems, adverse birth outcomes such as birth defects or shorter pregnancies, or developmental delays in America's heartland. The Heartland Study consists of 2 phases. In phase 1, we will recruit and enroll at least 2,000 pregnant women at partner hospitals and birth centers around the 13 Heartland states. We will then collect urine samples from mothers and biological fathers to measure levels of glyphosate, dicamba, and 2,4-D herbicides in these samples. Epigenetic changes arise from alterations in when, why, and how strongly various genes are expressed, which can impact the health of future generations. Dr. Benbrook was speaking a little bit about these just a minute ago. The Heartland Study is the first large-scale clinical study in the world designed to explore pesticide-induced epigenetic changes in humans, as opposed to in laboratory animals. We will collect samples of cheek cells from moms, dads, and their infants to look for biomarkers of epigenetic changes. Neurodevelopmental conditions in children like autism and ADHD are on the rise. Could pesticide exposure be playing a role? We want to find out. That's why in phase 2 of the Heartland Study, we will track babies' developmental milestones through at least age 3 and hopefully through age 16 if funding allows, so that we can identify any impacts on puberty as well. Are you wondering why we include fathers in the Heartland Study? Because science has shown that dad's exposure to pesticides can influence reproductive outcomes. We're going to hear a little bit more about that now from the principal investigators of the Heartland Study.
Melissa Perry. I'm professor and chair of the Department of Environmental and Occupational Health at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. I'm an epidemiologist and also a scientist who directs a laboratory at GW evaluating the health effects of pesticides. And I'm serving as a co-principal investigator on the Heartland Study, investigating the health effects of herbicides in particular on moms and babies. I also study research on the health effects of pesticides and sperm. That's what we do in the laboratory, And there's a lot of interesting and careful information that we are seeking to collect in the Heartland Study as it relates to paternal health and dad's health. I think there were three major reasons why I decided to be a part of the Heartland Study and the Heartland Health Research Alliance. The first was that it focused on people in the Midwest and it focused on herbicides. And I was really excited about that. I had years of experience working with farmers. I did extensive cohort study with farmers in Wisconsin. And I love the fact that we were working in the Heartland. It was just really compelling to me. That was number one. Number two was that I was thrilled by the multidisciplinary team. So it was about relationships. All of my life is defined by relationships. So it was about folks coming together who shared similar concerns and scientific perspectives or different scientific perspectives on these key questions. And then thirdly, it wasn't really about the controversy, because when you're working in public health, when you're trying to get at the best answers to the questions that are most perplexing, most concerning for the population, you don't care about the controversy, you're just looking for the truth. What I do as a scientist is I'm able to contribute new knowledge and new information so that the government can make better decisions, so that individuals can make better decisions. So I think it was about the ability to contribute new, valuable, much needed information on the health effects of herbicides and impacts on reproduction, pregnancy, and child health.
We began our work from the perspective of a bedside doctor, wondering why premature births happen, and as a corollary, why do they mostly happen during the month when the pesticides are highest? Babies born prematurely are often needing extensive care, and that's the number one disease that I treat. Birth defects are the leading cause of infant death. So between premature birth and birth defects, we have the two main problems that lead to death in the first year of life. We found that the birth defect rates also peaked in the month mothers were conceiving their child, that happened to coincide with a peak occurrence of pesticides in the environment. It turns out that one of the pesticides that we now find in every pregnant mother in Indiana causes obesity in rats over the first, second, and third generation, along with many other conditions, one of which is having abnormal pregnancies that often lead to not only fetal death, but maternal death. It's not just being next to the farm that they're getting exposed to. It's also in their food. So premature birth is on the rise, mother's death is on the rise, and that suggests that something really important is changing that's not good for our health.
I've been doing clinical research in obstetrics for a long time now. And really the reason I got into it is because I really like answering the why question. Why do we do practice the way we do? Why are certain women predisposed to different outcomes? Why are certain babies born in one way versus other babies who don't seem to have those complications? It's such a complicated system of interchange between mom's health, intrauterine health and environment, and the baby's development until the time of birth, that it's something we have to study in a complex way and in a complex system. One of the things I think is going to be really exciting about the Heartland study is we're really aiming to get a large percentage of our cohort from rural areas. So we can really see differences and get at disparities. We know there's healthcare disparities with rural women, rural people in general, as opposed to those who are in more urban areas, because there's better access to healthcare. Now, there's all sorts of barriers to healthcare for all people in all different environments, but I'm really excited about the Heartland study really going the distance to try to recruit people in rural areas because we can really understand the impacts of these exposures really well in a population that sometimes is just not included very often in clinical research. It can be important for people to donate to HHRA as if you really want to see this science done and done well and completely, we have to have the funds to do it. And without the funds, then we have freezers full of specimens, or we're unable to recruit as many women as we need to really demonstrate these associations like we feel we can.
Well, Dr. Haas did a great job explaining some of the challenges that the clinical side of the Heartland study faces. If we're going to be able not just to quantify the impact of overall herbicide exposure on birth outcomes, but actually identify which of the herbicides that pregnant women are exposed to routinely through their pregnancies are contributing to or triggering the adverse birth outcomes. Because it would be quite a stretch to take all herbicides away from farmers in the Midwest. That is not going to happen. So if it's a challenge for public health scientists and studies like the Heartland study to actually narrow down, figure out which herbicides are primarily responsible for adverse health outcomes and which ones aren't. Because we don't want to encourage EPA to impose regulatory restrictions on pesticides that are not causing problems, because farmers do need to control weeds. Weeds happen everywhere. One of the critical points that I want to share with everyone is we've got this great international group of scientists, and every month they come up with another idea of a way to try to answer another question through the Heartland study, which it's this large birth cohort study where we hope to bring 2,000 pregnant women and through pregnancy and delivery. And our scientists keep coming up with new ways that we could try to answer some very important public health questions about what herbicide exposures are doing. But every time we add a new layer or want to include a new herbicide in the study, the cost goes up. And so we're really up against trying to keep up with the scientists and their hopes and aspirations in answering a lot of questions in a relatively short amount of time so that we can make some changes in how weeds are controlled and assure that the next generation or two of children born in the Midwest don't suffer any developmental delays or heightened risk of adult onset disease. So there's a lot at stake in getting these answers and then acting on them. So now we're going to return to the PowerPoint and a little bit of more information about the scope of HHRA's work. So back to you, Rachel.
All right, so where do we go from here now that you understand the problem a little better? Well, we assure you that we have a plan to find answers for the public health questions our Alliance members are asking. You've already heard about the Heartland study. Please check our website at heartlandhealthresearchalliance.org to learn more about our other scientific research priorities. But right now, I want to tell you a little bit more about our efforts to amplify our science to ensure that it has an impact on food and farming practices. Communications, outreach, and education efforts are crucial for disseminating our science and amplifying our work and mission. One means of connection is through our weekly podcast and radio show, Heartland Stories Radio, hosted by organic pioneer and HHRA co-founder Teresa Marquez. The Heartland Stories Radio is available on all major podcast platforms, and you can also listen to episodes at heartlandstoriesradio.org. With weekly interviews featuring leaders and change makers in the food and ag industry, the episodes provide a venue for diverse voices with unique perspectives. with a shared goal to explore and cultivate change in food and farming in the Heartland and beyond. And now here's a highlight from a Heartland Stories radio episode with NC Witherspoon, the executive director of the Children's Environmental Health Network.
Of course, we need more of this research. We don't have all the answers, especially when it comes to young children and even women that are pregnant. I mean, there's a lot we still don't know. There's a lot we're not moving on that's available in science, but yet there are still some gaps of understanding. And even our childhood cancer report identifies, the gaps for sure. So we still need invested research, EPA and beyond.
We are also working hard to establish a robust social media presence. Please make note of these social addresses and join us in the conversation online. We're a new organization, so we're still growing our reach, and you can really help us. We encourage you to share our socials with your friends, family, and colleagues to help us grow. HHRA will also work to advance regulatory processes that are driven by research and science. Our goal is to ensure that insights from our work are a part of the policy debate and help inform regulatory agencies and decision makers. HHRA will also be focused on how integrated weed management must be part of the transition to climate smart farming, which is a major focus of the Biden administration. Plus, we have an academic fellowship program that is dedicated to engaging future scientists in research on food and farming for health. We currently have 2 institutions in the Alliance partnering in our academic fellowship program. As Dr. Landrigan mentioned, Boston College and also George Washington University in Washington, D.C.
My name is Molly Fung. I am currently a senior at Boston College studying environmental studies and political science. This summer, I conducted a research project looking at the ecological and social impact of growth regulator herbicides, particularly the herbicide dicamba, and especially focusing on the experiences of farmers and people in farming communities, and was able to conduct several interviews and continuing that work throughout the fall as part of my senior thesis as well. This was just a really exciting opportunity to apply, a public health lens and environmental lens to looking at sustainable agriculture, and giving me the opportunity to see what aspects of this work I might be interested in pursuing post-grad. I also got a ton of experience with hands-on research. I was really able to direct my project really independently. I wrote the proposal, I made contact and formed my questions that I wanted to ask. I took this in the direction that was really interesting to me. That was just really interesting experience that gave me, I think, the confidence to know that I can potentially do research work in the public health and agricultural field in the future.
My name is Ella Whitman, and I am a junior at Boston College studying global public health and the common good. And this summer, I had the opportunity to intern at the Planetary Health Alliance, and I was a part of their research and knowledge strategy team. My research project this summer looked at the global distribution of cancer and how it is affected by changes in crops' nutritional profiles due to rising CO2 levels in our atmosphere. Planetary health, the new and upcoming discipline that I got to be a part of this summer, looks at how changes in Earth's natural systems affect human health. And it encompasses not only science-driven research, an integral component, but also considers our ethical and moral obligations. One of the most difficult understandings I came to this summer was the necessity to convince other health professionals, even in the global health field, of this, interdependence between human health and Earth's natural systems. And the principal way of doing this is to communicate through data and research. So my internship made this opportunity for research possible, where I feel like I can make a meaningful contribution to the community to create this link and to persuade others in the field of global health. Funding from the Heartland Health Research Alliance allowed me to pursue this wonderful opportunity where I got to meet and communicate and interact with transdisciplinary professionals, whether it be research library scientists, principal investigators, or just a range of other scholars who really shared their work with me, encouraged me. I think as you're an undergrad, this internship program is such a formative step in building, you know, professional skills, academic knowledge, everything needed to take that next step in your career goals. And I'm so thankful.
Okay, Phil, you're good.
Here I am. Okay, good. Well, welcome back live, everyone. I think this has been a great 49 minutes. We've heard about the genesis of the Heartland Health Research Alliance, which lies in our concern for the rising just enormous increase in the use of pesticides and herbicides in the American Midwest and the Heartland. You've heard about the research we're doing, both the toxicological research that people like Robin Menage are doing, and the work that's going on with Dr. Paul Winchester and David Haas in the hospitals in Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin and the other Heartland states. And then you heard from a few of our students who are the next generation and who are the future. So now Chuck Benbrook wants to say a couple of words, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Okay,
So
they got a couple more slides first, so I was going to finish those.
let's do that, Rachel. Yep.
Okay. All right, so quickly, I just want to talk a little bit about moving past pesticides. Emerging agricultural research makes it clear that farmers have options, and yes, we can grow enough food to feed the world without using as many pesticides. Plus, moving away from pesticides as the only tool to control weeds and other farm pests provides benefits in many other aspects, including soil health, biodiversity, and climate change resilience. Visionary economist, author, and leader in the sustainability movement, Dr. John Eckerd spoke on Heartland Stories Radio about the momentum for change right now in food and farming.
We've got farms and local food systems that are emerging that have the capability of addressing the issues of climate change and health and rebuilding rural communities and taking care of the natural environment.
Hi, everyone. This is Audrey Tronlom. I serve as the Environmental Health Program Manager at the University of Northern Iowa Center for Energy and Environmental Education. And I'm also one of the most recent board members of the Heartland Health Research Alliance. I am in beautiful Benton County, Iowa, standing just off of the gravel road where I grew up, actually. And I thought this would be a good setting to tell you a little bit about why I think the work of HHRA and the Heartland Study is so important to me and what it is that I do. I oversee a statewide program called Farming for Public Health. And one of my most enjoyable roles in this position is to digest and translate the overlap in public health and agronomic research. Not a lot of people realize, but regenerative, sustainable, diverse, organic farming practices is public health in action, which in my opinion makes farmers public health professionals. The positive downstream impacts of their actions really does improve public and environmental health to all Iowans and Midwesterners at large. We're all downstream from somewhere. Changing the way we farm not only addresses pesticide application and exposure, but it also would improve water quality. It would reduce the frequency and devastation of floods, improve soil health, improve rural economic vitality, bring back biodiversity and pollinator habitat. The Heartland Study contributes so importantly to the growing body of work and rationale for farmers to exit the pesticide treadmill. I want to close with a sincere and heartfelt thank you to all of you, to HHRA, and to tell you that your support it's not just meaningful, it's impactful, it's important, and it's tangible. So thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Tom Green. I'm chair of the board of HHRA. I'm really excited to be working with HHRA. It's a very innovative model. What we're doing is taking cutting edge research that we're creating collaboratively with multiple institutions, and then translating that research into intelligent policy and changes in farmer practices on the ground. Too often research gets done, a paper gets published, and then it sits on the shelf and doesn't live up to its potential to influence policy and farmer practices. I've been working with farmers all over the world for the past 40 years to reduce the impacts of agriculture on health and environment. I'm really excited to be working with HHRA and hope that you will give us your support. Right now we're working primarily on herbicide use in corn and soybeans. We have almost 200 million acres of that growing in the US, and farmers are having to use more applications of more toxic herbicides to control weeds. We want to work with farmers and policymakers so that farmers can change to alternative practices and be more profitable and reduce their impacts on health and environment. Please join us in supporting this very important mission.
Okay, thank you very much. We hope you've enjoyed learning a little bit more about HHRA and our work. Please make a donation if you haven't already so we can maintain this momentum and keep our science moving forward. We have a little bit of time left for a Q&A with Dr. Landrigan and Dr. Benbrook. To ask a question, you can type in the chat window, or if you use the raise hand function on your Zoom bar, we will be able to turn on your mic so that you can speak directly to them. If anybody has lingering questions, we're happy to stay a little bit after the hour to answer them. So I'm going to get our experts on the line here, and you guys can go for it.
Hello again. We welcome your questions. There's lots going on here. Much work to be done. We're very enthusiastic about it. It's such important work to understand how these chemicals are affecting human health, and then to develop smart, intelligent policies to protect people against them.
Okay, we've got a question. So
good.
Nikki, if you want to go ahead, you should be able to talk.
Hi, thanks so much. My name is Nikki Cole. I'm calling in from Los Angeles. Thank you very much for this very important work that you're doing, and we'll be wanting to support it as much as possible. You have referred to some current research that's happening or has happened, and I'm wondering if you can point us maybe in the chat any links to what the current research is saying, particularly regarding birth defects and herbicides. Very curious here.
Good question, Nikki. One of the things that we're concerned about and tracking very closely is that there have now been 3 published birth cohort studies reporting an association between glyphosate exposure and preterm birth. Preterm birth is it's one of the more common adverse birth outcomes, and it's associated with heightened risk of some developmental issues and other issues. So we are definitely concerned about that. And the Heartland study, if we're able to bring 2,000 mother-infant pairs through the protocol, will be the largest confirmation of that finding. So we're definitely on top of that. We'll also be looking at low birth weight. Phil, did you want to add anything?
Yes, I would say the kind of study that we're doing here, which is called a prospective birth cohort study, has some enormous strengths over other studies. You know, in the past, when pediatricians and scientists have wanted to find the cause of something like autism or childhood cancer, they've interviewed the parents of a child with the disease. They've interviewed other parents whose children don't have the disease. And they ask each group of parents, well, what were you exposed to back when you were pregnant? And the problem is after 2 or 3 or 5 years, people just don't remember. They don't know what they were exposed to. And the studies are usually totally unproductive. By contrast, in the Heartland study, we're enrolling women during pregnancy. We're getting blood samples and urine samples and taking very detailed histories from them while they're pregnant. And then we're tracking their individual babies up through at least the first years of life after the babies are born. And the great strength of this design is that we can correlate a mother's individual exposure to glyphosate or dicamba or some other herbicide and an outcome in her child. So there's no muddying of the waters, there's no loss of information due to forgetfulness. It's a very powerful and a very elegant way of doing research. Of course, the negative here is that it's expensive. You have to take all those samples. You have to stay in touch with the families. You have to communicate with them frequently. You have to do evaluations of the babies every few years to see how they're growing and developing. And you have to do some very sophisticated statistical work to support those analyses. And all of that costs money, which is why we're here tonight. But that's the science of it. And thank you so much, Nikki, for the good question.
Yes, Nikki, let me add one more point. The reason that we decided to focus on pregnant women, birth outcomes, and children's development is it's the one area of the way that pesticides can impact public health where it's realistic to get some solid answers in 3, 4, or 5 years. If we were studying cancer, for example, that can take 10, 20 years. So we really feel that we have an opportunity to perhaps detect a really significant new public health threat in the Midwest that we maybe can do something about before it gets to be a really acute problem. So Phil, there was one other question.
Yeah, I'm looking at the chat screen. I'll read the question for those who may not see it. This comes from Kelly Ryerson. Kelly asks, doesn't the EPA look at pesticides to be sure they're safe? Why do we need this study? Well, in theory, the EPA should look at pesticides. It should do the proper studies to ensure that they're safe before they come to market to protect America's children. After all, that's why we pay taxes to support agencies to do that kind of work. Unfortunately, the EPA doesn't do a very good job. They accept a lot of information that is provided to them by the industries that are manufacturing the pesticide and who therefore have a vested interest in getting the pesticide licensed and on the market so they can sell it to farmers. They just never do the kinds of prospective multi-year epidemiologic follow-up studies that we've just been describing in the last couple of minutes. They don't have the kind of careful follow-up of people who are exposed to pesticides. This is very different from the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. When a new drug comes on the market, FDA has a very sophisticated network of what they call post-market surveillance that tracks adverse effects in people who've taken the medication. That's how they've picked up some of the problems a few years ago with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory agents. But there's no comparable system in place at all for pesticides. So it falls on groups like ours and the people who support us to do this work. And we see it as noble work. We see it as work which is protecting today's children in the United States of America and future generations of children. We're saddened, frankly, that the government, that the EPA is not doing it, but we see it's our responsibility to step up and do it.
So Kelly, I just might mention that the first published paper by a team of scientists, actually an international team brought together by HHRA, all scientists that are working with us on the Heartland Study, was published about 2 months ago in Environmental Health and lays out several of the primary and systemic problems with the way that federal law directs EPA to conduct pesticide risk assessments and make pesticide regulatory decisions. So for people that want a deeper dive into what needs to change in pesticide regulation, please visit our website. It'll be easy for you to find our environmental health commentary. And it's the first of a lot of what HHRA is going to have to say in the policy arena. Among our scientists and clinicians are several who have been deeply engaged in the policy process and served senior roles in administrations. Phil, you were President Clinton's Children's Health Advisor.
That's right. In 1997, 1998, so quite a few years ago now, I helped to set up the Office of Children's Health at EPA.
And Kathleen Merrigan, who's going to lead our policy program. She was a Deputy Secretary of Agriculture during the Obama presidency and is one of the most well-respected individuals that really understands all the ways that agriculture, food, and public health intersect. So we're not just going to do good science. We're going to get it out there. We're going to try to educate people about what it says about how we need to change the way we grow food and the choices that we make in our diets. And then also we're going to target where policies need to change to support constructive and positive change. Let me thank you all for participating in this first HHRA Zoom fundraiser. I hope the few technical glitches were not too distracting. We learned a lot. We hope you did. And thank you very much for your support.
Thank you.
Bye.